Okay, everyone, if you can kind of start making your way back in here. We'll be starting up our next session very, very shortly on Lecture 3, Same-Sex Attraction and Activity.
All right, we will plunge now into our next lecture, Same-Sex Attraction and Activity. There's a lot of ground to cover here, and I'm not sure whether we'll be able to cover it all. This is the place where there are basically 6 or 7 main biblical passages that deal with the question of same-sex attraction and activity. Ideally, we should be able to take time to do a thorough exposition of each of those. Unfortunately, that would require several hours more than we have allotted to us. And so our survey of those passages is going to be so brief as to be almost perfunctory. But here's what I hope to do during this session. Number one, I want to provide an overall biblical context for the debate about same-sex attraction and activity. Number two, I want to overview the so-called clobber passages. That's what they are called by the LGBTQIA crowd. They are the clobber passages. And honestly, sometimes we use them to clobber people with. I want to review the pro-LGBTQIA+ responses to those passages. I want to see what arguments they make. I want to examine, and by the way, respond to those arguments briefly. I want to examine the pro-stack script, and I want to respond to the so-called conversion therapy. Finally, I want to provide an alternative or a biblical script for those who face same-sex attraction and activity. So in terms of the overall biblical context, here's what we need to do. First, we need to affirm the creation and purpose of sex and marriage. We've already looked at that. We want to examine direct references to conduct, particularly same-sex conduct. We also want to examine indirect references to biblical principles that affect the topic. We want to heed the teachings of Jesus on sex and marriage. We want to accept the teachings of the apostles on sex and marriage. By the way, if I understand correctly, some of you have red-letter New Testaments where the words of Christ appear in red and the other words appear in black. If those New Testaments were done correctly, I think every word in the New Testament should appear in red, because the words that come to us through the apostles are the words of Christ. They are speaking for Christ when they speak. In other words, it's not just about the clobber passages, but about a full-orbed biblical vision of human sexuality. Still, we can't ignore the so-called clobber passages. Before we get to them, let me say a word about the open and affirming tactics. When they encounter these passages, how will they typically respond? Number one, they're going to begin by trying to make same-sex individuals, same-sex attracted and active individuals seem normal and appealing. They want to make same-sex activity look normal and appealing. They want to solicit sympathy for the pain that these individuals endure. And okay, let me pause right there. If you're dealing with people who are same-sex attracted or who are trans-identified, you are dealing with somebody who has faced significant pain. Part of that pain just comes from the dividedness that we all feel when we get involved in an idolatry. Part of it comes from the fact that these are people who have been singled out on many occasions for particularly brutal conduct, including sometimes physical beatings and even killings. Not so much recently, but at least in my case, within living memory. I can remember a time when it was fashionable to go beat up people like this. And there is a cultural memory among them that recalls that. They are not infrequently mocked. They endure a lot of pain. And so it's not difficult to solicit sympathy at that level. When they approach the biblical texts, they want to provide alternative interpretations of those texts. They want to emphasize the lack of moral foundation for traditionalism. Traditionalism is what I'm going to call a biblical approach to same-sex activity. And they will emphasize the Bible doesn't really teach what you're saying it teaches. You are actually getting your views from this or that kind of prejudice. Then they will redefine the problem in terms of identity and oppression. They insist that they are an identity group, just like, let's say, blacks or Asians, and they are oppressed in the same way that those groups are oppressed. They will want to depict us traditionalists as oppressors, and they will hold up their own activists as their principal heroes. Okay, so what about those passages? Here they are. Genesis 19, and Genesis 19, which is Sodom and Gomorrah, ties directly to Jude 6 and 7. Leviticus 18:22, Leviticus 20:13, Romans 1, verses 26 and 27, 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10, 1 Timothy 1, verses 8 through 11. We're going to take a brief look at each of these passages. I emphasize the word brief. I'm not going to be able to say everything that ought to be said, either in terms of criticism from the LGBTQ side or in terms of defense from a biblical interpretation side. Nevertheless, let's quickly take a look at some of these passages. Let's start out in Genesis 19 with the sin of Sodom. And if you will pardon me, I'm going to assume that you have a Bible with you and you can read that text on your own. I'm not going to take the time to read out the entire text, but you know the story. Lot goes into Sodom. He has two daughters who are in Sodom. He lodges with his sons-in-law. The men of Sodom surround the home. He's got two angels, and the angels, the men of the city demand that these angels, whom they take to be other men, the men of the city demand that the householders bring these men out, quote, that we may know them. And this text has commonly been taken to be God's condemnation upon Sodom for homosexual conduct. The objections, this is what the pro-LGBTQIA advocates are going to say. They're going to say Sodom's sin was not sexual. It was a lack of social justice. And they will quote Ezekiel 16:49. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and needy. So they will say, you see, the problem in Sodom was that there wasn't social justice. And even if there was a sexual element to Sodom's sin, the problem was really forcible rape. The men of the city were demanding to be able to rape these visitors, which is very different from consensual sex. Therefore, this passage says nothing about loving consensual same-sex relationships. But let's take Ezekiel 16:49 contextually. Yet you have not merely walked in their ways or done according to their abominations, but as if that were too little, you acted more corruptly in all your conduct than they. As I live, declares the Lord God, Sodom, your sister, and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. In other words, Judah is behaving even worse. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and needy. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations. And that word abominations, as it is translated here, is literally an abomination, one abomination before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. So I think our question needs to focus on that word abomination. We need to ask, what does it mean that Sodom committed an abomination? The word for abomination is to'evah. An abomination, to'evah, is something that is disgusting, it's detestable, it's repugnant. The word is particularly used of things that God detests. And when God declares something to be an abomination, that means that it's more than just a sin. There are sins that aren't abominations. So far as I know, there aren't abominations that aren't sins. In the Holiness Code of Leviticus, the word to'evah is used collectively for multiple acts that God detests. God tends to group them all together and to say, these things are abominations before me. The only time the term to'evah is used in the singular and it's applied to a single act is in the case of same-sex union. So, I'm going to say Ezekiel actually says more than pro-gay advocates wanted to say. The sin of Sodom, abomination, designates same-sex unions. Furthermore, intertestamental Jewish sources understood Sodom's sin to be sexual perversion. Jude 7 designates Sodom's sin as sexual immorality and, quote, going after strange flesh, which is a metaphor for unnatural sexual desire. So here's Jude, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, in the same way as these, indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. So I think we can draw these conclusions. Number one, Sodom did commit the sin of pride. Sodom also committed the sin of inhospitality. And Sodom did treat the poor and others shabbily. But besides all of those things, which were evils, those were wrongs, Sodom also engaged in same-sex activity. The sin here is not simply the how, as if it wouldn't have been a problem if it weren't rape. The sin, of course, that's sinful enough. No, I don't think anybody is going to say that rape isn't sinful. But God never destroyed a city for rape. The sin is also the what. In other words, it's the pursuit of same-sex activity. We go to the next passage, actually the next two passages, both of which occur in Leviticus. Leviticus 18:22, you shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination, to'evah. And then Leviticus 20:13, if there is a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a woman, both of them have committed a to'evah, detestable act. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. Here's what pro-LGBTQIA advocates have to say. They will say the contemporary situation assumed a power imbalance between the partners who were engaged in this activity. For example, pederasty. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but in ancient cultures, pederasty was the custom of an older man taking a younger boy as a sexual partner. Clearly, there is a power imbalance in that kind of relationship. Clearly, pederasty is a predatory activity, and pro-LGBTQIA advocates want to argue that what's being forbidden by Leviticus is that kind of predatory activity. They further argue that the passage only forbids unnatural same-sex activity. It doesn't address loving, committed relationships among those who are naturally same-sex attracted. And in any event, they will argue, there are lots of commands from the Torah that we don't observe, so why would we observe this one? You know, we eat catfish today. We eat pork today. You know, we don't build our houses with railings around the roofs. We wear mixed fabrics. We plant hybrid seeds. All of those things were forbidden under the law. So why would we single this thing out as something to avoid, something that we think is sinful? Response. Number one, none of the sexual laws in Leviticus 18 are qualified in any way. The same passage has regulations against incest. The same passage has regulations against bestiality. And it doesn't qualify any of those in the way that pro-gay advocates would like to qualify the prohibition against two men engaging in sexual activity. Where some degree of explanation or qualification is necessary, the text actually parses and defines. When it comes to incestuous relationships, the text spends a lot of words so that you will know exactly where the boundaries are supposed to be drawn, what's recognized as incest and what's not recognized as incest. What are the prohibited degrees of consanguinity? What are not the prohibited degrees of consanguinity? We don't find any of that kind of verbiage occurring with same-sex activity. The phrase, "as with a woman," implies that all same-sex activity violates gender complementarity. This goes back to some of the natural law stuff that we saw earlier. One thing that we can never do alone if the race is to survive is to procreate. Nor can the race survive if all males are procreating with other males and all females are procreating with other females. There is a gender binary that God has built into creation itself, and the morality is tied to the physical creation. And the Old Testament seems to regard any violation of that gender binary as an attempt to thwart God's purpose in creation, and it's always sinful. And if you're going to argue that this is just a prohibition against exploitive same-sex activity, you've got to remember that both parties to the act are condemned, including the one who ostensibly is being exploited. So you can't just say, you know, this is only a condemnation of what one partner is doing but not the other partner. No, they're both going to be put to death. And all the listed sexual sins are abominations. And, you know, incest, bestiality, all of those are labeled as abominations, plural. But only same-sex activity is singled out and named specifically as an abomination. And that's a pretty direct, straightforward statement. The only topic that Moses deals with in this context that doesn't fall under the category of abomination, that is a prohibited activity, is for a husband to have intercourse with his wife during her period. That is not said to be an abomination. That appears to be a part of what God intends as specific for Israel, and that's all I'm going to say about that. When it comes to the question, well, you know, we don't keep other laws, why do we keep this one? Let's talk about law-keeping for a moment. In the first place, law-keeping is never a mechanism for either salvation or sanctification. We don't get saved by keeping God's law. God's law is what condemns us. And we don't make ourselves holy once we are saved by keeping God's law. Specific laws are grounded in God's plan and were intended for Israel and do not apply to the church. I should say some specific laws are grounded in God's plan, were intended for Israel, do not apply to the church. Eating pork, it was sinful for Israel. It's not sinful for all people at all times in all places. Eating shellfish was sinful for Israel. It is not sinful for all people at all times in all places. In fact, the New Testament explicitly tells us that Jesus declared all foods to be clean. So there's no prohibition there that binds us. So the language we would use is to say that the Israel-directed laws were positive laws for Israel. They were occasional laws, but they are not timeless regulations for all people at all times in all places. But many of the laws in the Pentateuch are grounded not just in God's plan for Israel, they are grounded in God's character. And they're grounded in the way that God has made the world, and those laws apply to all people at all times and in all places. We call that God's moral law. By the way, if we reason from both sides, I've already said this, if we reason from both sides, what we know about God's moral law should end up being identical to what we discover in God's natural law, what we discover that God has built into the natural world. But looking at it from the biblical side, certain of God's laws are grounded in his character, and those apply all the time to everybody. How do we know which is which? How do we know which Old Testament laws are just for then and there, and how do we know which ones are for here and now? The general rule of thumb is that we decide which is which by observing how the New Testament treats those commandments. We ask, does the New Testament repeat those commandments? Or we might ask, are those Old Testament laws somehow grounded in nature rather than simply in God's plan and declaration? If the answer to those questions is yes, then we view them as timeless laws. And the laws against same-sex conduct are not only repeated, they are actually amplified and explained in the New Testament. So we regard those laws as timeless laws. It's interesting to me that the LGBTQIA advocates don't make, at least generally don't make the same arguments, let's say, for the laws against bestiality. They don't say, well, these laws are designed to govern exploitive relationships, but if you've got a loving, caring relationship with your Nubian goat, well then, no, they don't say that. And the reason is because even they recognize that's a bridge too far. Simple fact is, if you can't use that argument in the one instance, you can't use it in the other. So we go to our next passage, which is Romans 1, 26 and 27. For this reason, God gave them over. Paul has been detailing in the context the reason that God holds all people accountable. All humans have rebelled against God, and therefore all are under God's judgment. In the process of doing that, Paul goes through 3 cycles in which humanity, having initially rebelled against God, God hands them over or delivers them over to yet deeper levels of sinfulness. And these are judicial acts on the part of God. And we're looking here at the first level. For this reason, God gave them, second level. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural, and in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. People who want to justify same-sex activity are going to say this. They're going to say the problem in these verses is not same-sex activity. The problem in these verses is excessive lust. Men, for example, who have been so overcome with lust that in an unnatural way, they are using other men even though they are naturally inclined toward women. Or they would say the problem is exploitive activity. Again, pederasty comes into this. It's only exploitive same-sex relationships that are being singled out. They would argue same-sex activity is natural for some people. It's only unnatural for those whose desires don't align with it. So if you're naturally attracted to people of the same sex, then this activity isn't unnatural for you. And in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul is dealing with head coverings. In 1 Corinthians 11, he speaks of hair length as natural and unnatural. So clearly they would say the concept of being natural and unnatural is culturally relevant. We wouldn't insist on applying the same rules for hair length that Paul applies in 1 Corinthians 11. And I know right now some of you are saying, I would, and that's fine. But they're going to say almost nobody does that, and so why would we apply the same standard in Romans 1? If we don't insist on following what is natural, according to 1 Corinthians 11, why do we insist on following what is natural, quote unquote, in Romans 1? Brief response. First thing you've got to notice is that Paul is including female same-sex activity in what goes on here. Female same-sex activity, lesbianism in the ancient world, so far as we can tell, never included a power imbalance. It never included an exploitive element. There never was any form of female pederasty. So it doesn't work to bring the passage under that rubric. Second, the problem, as Paul expresses it, is not the degree of desire. The problem is the direction of desire. The word natural, we need to understand what that means. Typically, same-sex advocates are going to say natural means, something like it occurs in the natural world. And they'll go down that road. You sometimes see dogs engaged in same-sex activity. You sometimes see rats engaged in same-sex activity. The bonobo apes related to the chimpanzees. Bonobos regularly engage in same-sex activity. And since it's all over nature, Paul must have been wrong when he says it's unnatural. But that's not what Paul means by the word natural. When Paul says that a thing is natural or unnatural, he means that it is or isn't being used according to its nature. What is the nature of an eye? An eye is for seeing. What is the nature of an ear? An ear is for hearing. Now, you can slice off your ear and fry it up like bacon and eat it. That's an unnatural use of the ear. Okay? What is the natural function of the tongue? The tongue is for speaking. What is the natural function of the hand? The hand is for grasping. When Paul talks about what is natural, he's talking about design. He's talking about what things are for. And what he's saying is that human sexuality is designed for a particular thing. It's designed to accomplish a particular purpose, and same-sex activity thwarts that purpose. It is therefore unnatural. If you want to talk about 1 Corinthians 11, there is, regardless of your interpretation of 1 Corinthians 11, there is a stable part of that passage that is true in all cultures. And that is that there is a distinction between males and females, and that distinction ought to be recognized in gendered behaviors. In other words, what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 11 is that men ought to act like men and women ought to act like women, and particularly women shouldn't act in ways that bring shame onto their husbands. Okay? And you can argue about whether the hair length itself was unnatural or whether it's just the hair length in that cultural betraying an unnatural posture that was being taken by certain people. One way or the other, there is a natural and an unnatural element involved in 1 Corinthians 11. So that objection really holds no water. Passage number 5 is 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11. Paul asks, "Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. Such were some of you. But you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God." Okay, those who want to advocate for same-sex relationships. Let me include the Timothy passage here as well. But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers and immoral men and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, with which I have been entrusted. Okay, so notes on these verses. The word malakoi, which is the word that the King James translates as effeminate or effeminate men, appears to mean men who allow themselves to be used by other men sexually. In other words, Paul in these verses is drawing a distinction between, in a same-sex male relationship, the male who takes the male role and the male who takes the female role. And malakoi is being used to designate the second. The word arsenokotai involves two elements. Arsene is the Greek word for male. Koite is the Greek word for bed. So the term essentially means bedders of male, that is to say, males who take other males to bed for sexual purposes. Those who want to advocate for a pro-gay position will register these objections. First, they will say only exploitive relationships such as pederasty or prostitution are being condemned. If you got the notion, that's kind of their ace in the hole, to use a carnal metaphor. This is when all else fails, you can always go back to this argument. And these prohibitions don't forbid loving, committed same-sex relationships. Response: Paul had perfectly good words for pederasty, prostitution. In fact, he uses some of those words in other places. He could use those words anytime he meant those things, but that's not what he says here. Second, the Bible doesn't distinguish exploitive from non-exploitive forms of other sexual sins. The prohibitions against adultery, for example, don't only apply to exploitive adultery. The prohibitions against incest don't only apply to exploitive incest. Prohibitions against bestiality don't only apply to exploitive relationships. Why would we think they do here either? Paul is coining this word, aisenokatai, directly from the Greek of the Septuagint in Leviticus 18 and 20. The Septuagint, for those of you who don't know, I guess I'm assuming too much in what I'm saying here. The Hebrew Old Testament was, in the centuries before Jesus, translated into Greek. And the Greek translation of the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Old Testament, is known as the Septuagint. In these two passages, which we've already looked at, the same-sex activity is designated by the terms arsene and koitos. And what Paul is doing is jamming those terms together here, basically tethering his prohibitions to those Old Testament texts. In other words, Leviticus 18 and 20 and Paul's instructions to Timothy and to the Corinthians, all of those stand together as a block. All of those texts constitute a common warning together. And in these texts, same-sex activity is considered lawless and rebellious, and it bars one from the kingdom of God. And Paul is very specifically naming both partners to the same-sex activity. So in summary, looking at these so-called clobber passages, the Bible is unequivalent in its rebuke of same-sex activity. Both male and female forms are considered to be wrong. Both partners in the relationship are in the wrong. Malakos further rebukes, I think, effeminacy in males. In other words, it's not just condemning the male who allows himself to be treated as a female. It's, I think, rebuking the male who adopts effeminate mannerisms and dress in order to be attractive to an arsenoikaitos. The passages rebuke and are not restricted to exploitive relationships. The rebukes are not restricted to exploitive relationships within power imbalances, and there are no exceptions being made in the text for loving, committed relationships. Now, homosexual advocates will say, well, they didn't know at that time that there could be loving, committed relationships among same-sex partners. And the quick response to that is that we certainly have the poems of Sappho, and we have writings from others that let us know that often these same-sex relationships were viewed as being loving and committed. There were love relationships that took place here, and that makes no difference whatever to Paul. Paul is actually rebuking the whole lot. Just a comment here on sources to read. You've got a separate bibliography that was given to you in your packet. Let me single out some of the books that you're going to encounter there. Number one, Kevin DeYoung, What Does the Bible Really Teach About Homosexuality? If you only have time to read one book on the subject, this should probably be the book. It's long enough to do justice to the arguments. It's short enough to be read within a limited period of time. If you want to go deeper, Robert Gagnon. I know, those of you who speak French, you want to say that's Gagnon. I've actually asked the man, how do you pronounce your family name? And he says, well, if we were French, we would pronounce it Gagnon, but we just pronounce it Gagnon. So Robert Gagnon, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, Texts and Hermeneutics. This is I don't know, 500, well, I've got it right there, 500-page work. It's nearly encyclopedic in terms of his treatment of the arguments on both sides of this issue. If you want to go deep, this is the book you want to go with. Not all of you will have the measure of interest to endure this much speech about this topic. But for those of you who just need to do the research, this is your starting place. By the way, those of you who have Facebook accounts, Robert Gagnon also has a Facebook page in which he regularly addresses these issues and others, and I would recommend his Facebook page to you. R. Albert Mohler is the editor of a very short volume, VSV, entitled God and the Gay Christian, a response to Matthew Vines. Matthew Vines was several years ago a young man just out of college who wrote a book from an evangelical perspective trying to justify same-sex activity within loving, committed relationships. And Mohler led the faculty at Southern Baptist Seminary to produce a very brief response. And this response is worth looking at. It's not as detailed as DeYoung and not nearly as detailed as Gagnon, but it's still worth a glance. You'll find most of the major arguments here and most of the responses here. So now we come to this question. How do we help people who experience same-sex attraction, many of whom may actually be engaged in same-sex activity? Well, some Christians, as you know, only want to condemn them. And clearly, Scripture does condemn the behavior. But I'm going to say condemning the persons is not biblical. It doesn't present an accurate view of Christianity to parade around with picket signs saying God hates fags. That is no representation of biblical Christianity. There are 3 available scripts for people who have same-sex attraction. One is the secular script. One is conversion or reparative therapy. That's a complete script of its own. And one is the biblical and gospel-centered script. Let's start with the secular script. I mentioned Mark Yarhouse in your bibliography. I'm taking this script directly from him because I don't think I can describe it any better. I've changed some of his wording to make it briefer, but this is owing to Yarhouse. Here's what young people are being taught. Same-sex attractions signal a naturally occurring or intended by God distinction between homosexuality, heterosexuality, and bisexuality. Same-sex attractions are the way you know who you really are. In other words, it's an identity. And the emphasis here is on discovery. You find out who you are as you push the boundaries on the behaviors. Same-sex attractions are at the core of who you are. They're not just a tangential element. They are really you. Same-sex behavior is simply an extension of the core of who you are. So if you want to actualize yourself, if you want your behavior to match who you really are, if you want to be authentic, then according to your sexual identity, then you need to engage in the practices. Self-actualization of your sexual identity is crucial for your fulfillment. Nobody has the right to deny that to you. A quick response. We'll deal with identity in the next lecture. We've already dealt with it some. We'll deal with it some more. Sexual activity is not who you are. You never need to engage in sexual activity to actualize your identity. And these principles are true whether you're same-sex attracted or whether you're other-sex attracted. You can faithfully be who you are even if you never engage in sexual activity. If you're a married man and you love your wife and you are powerfully attracted to her, and I hope you are, and she becomes ill and disabled so that you will never enjoy physical intimacy again, it doesn't make you any less who you are, and it doesn't make your love for her any less if you remain faithful to her and remain chaste for the rest of your life. Okay, let's talk about reparative or conversion therapy. I've given you a short description here from Joe Dallas. Reparative therapy is a phrase referring to counseling, psychotherapy, or other forms of psychological treatment for homosexuals who are in conflict over their sexuality. It derives from a theory that homosexuality represents unmet emotional needs or conflicts that need repairing, in which cases therapy should attempt to repair the damage or deficits of personal experience. What this is simply saying, if you experience same-sex attraction, that's because you have been damaged by some relationships in your past, and the right kind of counseling can reaffirm that what was once damaged and remake you into what you ought to be. Problems with reparative therapy, it's not grounded in the gospel. It sees same-sex activity or attraction as mainly a psychological problem. It sets the wrong goal. It effectively tries to trade same-sex lust for other sex lust. And on my view, that's not a tremendous advance. There's actually a good article written on this topic in the original edition of the ACBC essays, and I'm pretty sure you can access that online if you just search for that article. By the way, reparative therapy, conversion therapy it's in the news these days because 20-odd states have outlawed it if you're a licensed clinician, and we've got now the ACLJ that has fought this thing all the way to the Supreme Court. My view is reparative therapy is false and it doesn't work, but it's an abridgment of free speech to forbid it. And that same kind of abridgment is going to be used against us sooner or later. And so clinicians ought to have the right to work with reparative therapy if they want to, even though I don't think it's going to do anybody any good. So what's the biblical script? Here it is. Whether male or female, You're made in the image of God. In fact, more than that, it's not just that you're made in the image of God. You are the image of God. And sex is an aspect of God's good creation. It's part of what we're responsible to use according to its design. Because we're fallen, we all of us experience disordered or inordinate affections about all kinds of things. Some of us have an inordinate attraction to money, some to food, some to prestige, some to security, and some to sex. And our disordered affections take us in different directions. If you have a disordered affection with respect to food, that might lead you into gluttony, it might lead you into anorexia. But all of our disordered affections come from the same place. They come from our fallen nature. So our disordered affections don't define us. They're not our identity. They are accretions to us. Your affections are no more who you are than the stuff that you blow out of your nose is who you are. To the degree that we treat our affections as our identity, they become idols that will frustrate us. And the solution to all disordered affections, I don't care whether you are disordered in the direction of greed or in the direction of gluttony or in the direction of anorexia, whatever your disordered affection may be, the hope is always the sufficiency of Christ. In regeneration, followed by increasing sanctification, followed by the promised hope of change. Christ changes us when he saves us, and he keeps on saving us. So there is hope for people who experience disordered affections. What's the biblical script? Our goal is not to convert homosexuals into heterosexuals. Not that I don't think there can be a change of affection. I think there can be, there should be, and as discipleship occurs over the long haul, there will be. But our goal is to see the likeness of Christ developing in all believers. And the likeness of Christ may develop in other ways faster than you are able to get rid of this particular or that particular disordered affection. Furthermore, churches are assemblies of forgiven sinners of all sorts. You remember, Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and he mentioned a whole ugly list of sins, including homosexuality. And at the end of the list, he says, and such were some of you. How many of us have the righteousness that God requires to enter his kingdom on our own merit? Right. In other words, we are not all same-sex attracted. We are not all same-sex active, but we are in some sense deficient in our conformity to God's actual plan and purpose. And churches are assemblies of people who are still in the process of being conformed to the image of Christ. We have forgiven sinners of all sorts. And so as we gather, what we have to do is to practice mutual encouragement, mutual warning, mutual discipline, and mutual restoration when we fail. And in the meanwhile, we must kill our willingness to respond to sin. Mortification of sin comes directly out of the gospel. And this is not works righteousness. And this is not, if you sit back and yield yourself to God, he will take all those desires from you. I don't see anything like that in Scripture. You kill sin. And you do that by fighting temptation. We need fewer pacifists and more heroes. Now, I admit same-sex attraction is tough for those who experience it. But you know what? All temptations are tough. My temptation isn't the same as your temptation. But don't think for a moment that I don't have to wrestle every day with the flesh. Same is true of you. And if you tell me you don't, I've got a word for you. Bottom line, we are no less ourselves, and we need be no less fulfilled if we refuse to indulge any of our disordered affections. And I think it's time for me to quit.